2nd of September 2023. In this news flash, I want to talk about the Russian economy. We're sitting with a situation that, on the one side, MSM is always reporting negative about Russia. And when America and the EU unleashed their sanction war against Russia, you had the situation that there were Americans that were making statements that Russia is a fuel station with nukes, and Biden said he's going to turn the ruble into ruble. Now, I have to talk about that ruble first, but before I talk about that, let me introduce you to something that I have to endure. And this is from that pet Nazi of mine. He says, jy het 'n lekker issue gemaak oor jou Nazi stalker se bewering oor die roebel. Waar staan hy nou? 3 question marks. Staan die Russiese ekonomie nog sterk? 4 question marks. Jou intelligensie laat veel te wense oor as jy nie reg van die begin af kon sien dat die Russiese ekonomie ineen gaan stort nie. Now, just a quick translation. He said, I made a big issue about him, the Nazi stalker, and his statements about the ruble. And he wants to know where it is now. And then he asks, does the Russian economy still stand strong? And then he says, my intelligence is suspect if I could not see from the beginning that the Russian economy will collapse. Now, that statement of his is exactly based in the MSM propaganda that he sucks up like a sponge. He doesn't analyze anything, he just reads the headlines, and then he goes on to his rants and he promotes it all over into his friend circle. I've blocked him on my YouTube channel and on my Telegram channel that he cannot comment there because he blabbers mountains and pages full of shit. But he does it firmly convinced that he is in possession of the ultimate truth. Now let me handle the ruble issue. Here is a chart of the ruble's performance for the past 2 years. Now if you look carefully at that chart, you will see there's that massive spike where the ruble, that was directly after the sanctions were instituted against Russia, and Biden's statement that he will turn the ruble into ruble. And the ruble shot up to 135 rubles per dollar from around about 77. Now, let's look at it objectively. First of all, at that moment, the West stole literally billions of dollars of worth of Russian foreign exchange. That they stole. So that's immediately out of the Russian cash flow. Secondly, it does have a psychological effect on the population. And this is where you need to take note of some realities. In the West, at situations where there were serious financial problems, the first thing that you see is the population doing a bank run, and they try to get as much cash out of the banks as possible. Now that was very dangerous for Russia at that moment when this happened. But the Navalny is in charge of the Russian central bank, and she immediately implemented a few basic things to stabilize the ruble. No concern with the dollar and the ruble-dollar value. She needed to stabilize the ruble. And through various things that they did, the Russian population realized that they were under severe attack from the West. And contrary to what happens under conditions like this in the West, in Russia, the Russian people, instead of doing a bank run, which the West were bargaining on, the Russian people went to the banks and deposited the cash they had in under their beds and in cupboards and in tins and whatever. They started making deposits into the banks. That gave the ruble a lot of stability. And if you look at that chart, you can see in February it shot up, and by April it was almost back to what it was pre-war. And then it kept on strengthening. Why? Yes, the central bank was supporting the ruble, but the problem for the West was Russia is the main supplier of grain, wheat, and the main supplier of fertilizers. And they are a major supplier of gas and oil. All things that the rest of the world needs. The sanctions, another thing, Putin immediately issued instructions that unfriendly countries must pay for their gas in rubles. No longer in dollars or euros or what. They must pay in rubles. If they don't want to pay in rubles, he doesn't sell it to them. And India, China, Vietnam, Iran immediately switched to that, and they paid the rubles. The West, in Europe, a large number of the gas suppliers there did the same. They switched to rubles. Those that didn't want to switch to rubles were cut off. Okay, all of that strengthened the ruble. Because you must understand, they're working now against that deficit. I think it's about $400 billion of foreign exchange that the West stole from the Russians. So they had to make that shortfall up. They stabilized it, and that was it. And if you look at the graph, you can see from June 2022 right up to about December 2022, the ruble was fairly stable around about between $60 and $65 of rubles to the dollar. But at the same time, the Russian export market grew tremendously. The Russian production facilities, the Russian industry started recovering from the effect of the sanctions, and they did import replacements and things like that. For us as South Africans, we understand how this works because we went through the same shit when the West started sanctioning South Africa. So the Russian economy adjusted. And by the end of December, January, around about January, the Russian central bank stopped supporting the ruble. Nabelina was of the view that they must allow the ruble to find its natural value in the market. But you must understand, Russia exports a hell of a lot. They export a hell of a lot. And China and India were buying a lot. The Chinese took up all the gas that the Europeans didn't want, no longer wanted. All that gas went to China. So there was no drop in the gas production in Russia. The other problem is that the gas availability in Russia became tight because with the Europeans unable to run their own fertilizer plants anymore, the demand on Russian fertilizer went through the roof. So the Russians had to use a lot of their gas that they used to sell to the Europeans, use a lot of that gas in the manufacturing of fertilizers. Now, at the back end, all of this means actual industrial activity. So our stoker is waiting for the Russian economy to collapse. But the West didn't understand the Russian economy. They didn't understand that. They didn't know what the fuck was going on there. After Putin took control of Russia, they started immediately changing their economic system from the communist system into a free market system, a market system. And contrary to the West, a lot of the factories, the manufacturing plants in Russia were not shut down on demand by the Greens. The Russians upgraded those factories. Plus, on their weapon side, they tuned down the output, but they did not tune down the factory capacity. They just tuned the output down and focused on manufacturing consumer goods. So we get to the point that all of a sudden the ruble is rising fast against the dollar. And in September it reached 102. And at that point, a lot of the people, including my pet Zazi, were saying, there goes the Russian economy. But they make statements like that without looking at the reality. I'm going to show you some tables now in which I'm trying to make this easier to understand. Now look at this table. And as I said, Russia is the exporter. Now at $60 per barrel, look what happens to the facts. At $60 per barrel, the Russians get 3,600 rubles for that barrel of oil. But at 90, they get 5,400 rubles for that barrel. Look at that. Let that sink in. So what is the best for the Russian economy? A strong ruble or a weak ruble? Obviously a weak ruble. Because that weak ruble means a hell of a lot more rubles comes into Russia, comes into their economy. So the producers of the oil, instead of getting 3,600 rubles for a barrel, they're getting 5,400 rubles for a barrel. That is a massive difference, because you must understand that producer, he buys everything in rubles and he pays his wages in rubles. So for him it's better. So exporters are always benefiting when the currency goes weaker against the dollar. We've seen it here in South Africa. Our farmers are having a ball because they can be very competitive when it's 18 rand to the dollar. But when it's 14 rand to a dollar, they're less competitive. The only thing that is a problem when your currency weakens like the ruble has weakened is it makes it expensive for importers. Russian importers, they get the other side of the coin. But look at this. If a thing is manufactured in Russia and the Russians want $1 million for that thing, at $60 per ruble, that means 60 million rubles. At 90, it means 90 million rubles. Now look at that difference for a Russian exporter. So obviously that exporter likes that 90. But then we get to the other side of the coin. The Russian manufactures a thing and he wants 1 million rubles for that thing. So the buyers on the outside, at $60 to the ruble, that buyer must pay $16,666 for that item. But at 90, he only pays $11,000. Look at that difference. So, now ask yourself, what is better for Russia? A weak dollar, a ruble against the dollar, or a strong one? And that is why, now, when it reached that 102 or 105, I'm not sure, let me check. Yeah, it shot to 102. The Russian central bank decided that they're going to step in, and they made some changes to strengthen the ruble a bit. Because they have to keep that ruble at a level that suits their trading partners. And their big trading partners is the Chinese and the Indians and Iran and the whole BRICS environment. So don't sit and get orgasmic when you see the ruble weakens against the dollar. It makes sense in the economy. Then we go on to this. Briekmerke man tweeted this. Russia got $600 billion richer last year, while North America and Europe got nearly $11 trillion poorer. Cue Joe Biden. I did that meme. Russians got richer last year even as the war in Ukraine raged on, while the US and Europe lost trillions of dollars, UBS reported. Russia added 600 billion of total wealth, the Swiss bank found in its annual global wealth report. The Swiss bank, for my Nazi stalker, the Swiss bank, not CNN or BBC or RSG, the Swiss bank. The number of Russian millionaires also rose by about 56,000 to 408,000 in 2022, while the number of ultra-high net worth individuals, people worth over $50 million, jumped by nearly 4,500. But the US lost more wealth than any other country last year, shedding $5.9 trillion, while North America and Europe combined got $10.9 trillion poorer. UBS reports that. UBS, to my Nazi stalker, not RT or Sputnik, UBS. Now that is something to take note of. And that is realities. These are realities, not shit that you think in your own little quiet corner sitting there devouring the CNN page. And then we get to this one. Listen carefully. The Pentagon increased the production of 155mm shells 6 times, up to 90,000 pieces monthly. So many have not been made in America since the Korean War. Now that sounds impressive, but if you look at what's happening in the Ukraine, they're firing 60,000 rounds a day. So there's not a lot of ammo there. But then look at the other side of the coin. Russia's July ammo production blast past 2022 total. The production of ammunition in Russia for July 2022 alone has exceeded the figures for the entire last year, according to the Russian Minister of Industry. The West doesn't have that capacity. The Russians has fired up those factories over there and they're working 3 shifts and you can see the results. But my Nazi stalker tells me the Russian economy is collapsing. Meanwhile, their industrial output is shooting through the sky. And they prove it. You can see it. They don't run out of ammo. And then we get to this. Dmitry Medvedev. Our enemy is constantly counting painfully how much and what we have left. Tanks, shells, missiles and more. This is understandable. Enemy propaganda lives by its own laws. But not only such a calculation is quite in the logic of the very existence of the Bandera state. After all, it is a parasitic country and received food from the body of its owners, lives at the expense of them. There will be no arms supplies and everything will end quickly for the Bandera regime. the parasites will die. We provide ourselves with all types of weapons, ourselves, and today already quantities exceeding the current needs of the armed forces. This is how our military-industrial complex operates now. Its conveyors work in 3 shifts, and he will produce armaments as much as necessary for the effective defense of our fatherland. And look at that. Now, you must keep this in relation to the fact that we know it's all over the news everywhere how Zelensky is begging for more and more weapons, give more tanks, give more this, give more that, give more that, all of that. And the West is scrounging. I mean, they're sending shit that was in museums, they're sending shit that is sitting in warehouses since 1960. They're scraping the bottom of the barrels. But in the meantime, the Russians are producing. They're producing their own stuff. Who can remember the joke about this drive where they're trying to collect tanks for Ukraine? Look at this. This is a Russian manufacturing plant. Look how the tanks is coming out. This is a Russian factory making airplanes, fighter planes. Look at that. This is some of the equipment that they manufacture. And incidentally, these things were on display at the recent gathering they had in Moscow with weapons. And they are selling tons of weapons. That's now, once again, the advantage of the weaker ruble makes them much more competitive, while at the same time, the Russian side receives a hell of a lot more rubles. And then we get this. This is for that Zazi Stoker of mine. It seems to me he is also under that spell of superior logic and natural intelligence. World of statistics. USA debt, $32.8 trillion. USA GDP, $26.85 trillion. So you can see that 6 trillion, their debt is bigger than $6 trillion of their GDP. UK debt, 3.28 trillion. UK GDP, 3.16 trillion. Also, the debt is more than their GDP. But this is the elements that my Zazi Stoker see as absolutely unbeatable. And then we get to Russia. Russian debt, 288 billion. Billion with a B, not trillion, billion. Russian GDP, 2.06 trillion. Now, you don't need to be a rocket scientist. If you look at these figures, you can clearly see who is in the shit. Definitely not the Russians. And then we get to this. This was tweeted by RJ Politics. I like this guy, and he's really informed on his numbers. He's up there. Russian Federation President Vladimir Putin. President Vladimir Putin has yet to die of cancer of various types, a rare blood disease, Parkinson's disease. President Putin still has not started a nuclear war. Russia, under most devastating economic sanctions in the world history, had a year-over-year GDP growth of 4.9% in June. Core inflation rate is 3.18%. Unemployment is 3%. The MOEX, that's a Moscow exchange, has risen 42.5% over the past year. Putin is bleeding the West dry in Ukraine and has 80% job approval rating. Now it just doesn't get better than that. And, well, this is something that my Zazi Stoker He's got hemorrhoids exploding when he reads stuff like that, but that's his problem. If he wants to play the game that he is playing, he needs to have a good solid stock of underwear at hand. And then we get to this. And that is in response to that debt that I showed you earlier. Do they mean Russia has less debt? What if we also compare GDP in PPP terms? In a Russian city, a haircut costs 350 to 400 rubles. That is $4. And in the US, the average cost at the barber shop is $20. Five times more. But Russians don't whine about rising fuel prices and don't put Putin did that stickers on gas stations. That's the reality. That's the fact. And then we get to this interesting piece of information. A meat processing plant will be built in the Peskov region for 30 billion rubles. It's 5 times more than the budget of the city of Peskov. This is probably the biggest agro project in Russia in recent years. The new production facility will create 3,000 jobs, and Velikolok Agro Holding will be in charge of construction. Some of the products are planned to be exported. There is interest among consumers even in such distant countries as Cuba, Vietnam and Hong Kong. Now what you must take note of here is that they're building these plants and the equipment that goes in there is mostly locally produced and they import from China. And this is the thing. The European economy is absolutely collapsing. I've read many things about it and I have spoken about it. The fact of the matter is that the European citizens are getting poorer every day. They are struggling to put food on their tables. They cannot cope with the high energy prices. But the Russians carry on. And my Zazi stalker, he sits there firmly believing that the Russian economy is collapsing. Now my advice to him would be that he should really start paying attention to non-MSM information centers. He's got a few YouTube guys that he follows, but absolute fanatics. I've listened to a few of the guys that he links for me, and then he challenges me to respond to it. I never respond. And I just go and take a look, and we have, you can see immediately, it's propaganda channels. But he sucks it up like a thirsty gazelle in the desert that reaches an oasis. And that's it. And what I really cannot understand is that people don't look at the realities of certain statements. But that is the time that we live in. In any case, I hope this was informative and has value to some of you. Please give me a like and a subscribe and share the thing. The sharing is very important. I mean, I am so shadow banned Facebook, Twitter, YouTube. And it's only by sharing, you sharing the stuff, that more people can see. I really appreciate your support. Thank you.